All right, we begin with a trivia. Who is the Jewish hero that was able to gather all of his people without anyone rebelling against him? No, it wasn't Moses. It wasn't Matisyahu. It wasn't Abraham. Guess who? Yes, it was Mordechai in the story of Purim. Who was this man, Mordechai? Let's take a look at his brief biography in the book of Esther, which we call the Megillah, the story of Purim. The co-hero of the book of Esther and the Purim story is Mordechai, the spiritual leader of the generation, whom the Talmud dramatically introduces with the famous verse. And this is how they describe who he is. It goes, there was a Jewish man, they called him Ish Yehudi, in the city of Shushan, the capital, and his name was Mordechai, the son of Yair, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, Ish Yemini. So on this verse, the Talmud raises an apparent contradiction. First, the Megillah calls him Ish Yehudi. But at the end of the verse, it calls him Ish Yemini. What was he? Was he a Yehudi, which means he's from the tribe of Judah? Or was he Yemini, from the tribe of Benjamin? Now the Talmud offers various answers to this, and among them they suggest that Mordechai hailed from the tribe of Benjamin from his father's side, the tribe of Judah from his mother's side, or alternatively, that Ish Yehudi is in a way a generic term for any proud Jew who acknowledges God and pushes away any idolatry. And that Mordechai was called Ish Yehudi because he embodied that trait. Now the truth is, these are just technical answers. But in a deeper sense, the previous Chabad Rebbe explains a most profound inner meaning and the significance of Mordechai's identity as both an Ish Yemini and an Ish Yehudi. He says these are two types of Jewish leaders. One is called the Ish Yehudi, which means a strong believer in a proud Jewish identity, a zealous defender of the Jewish faith. For this leader, the honor of the Torah and at following all its laws is the sole guiding factor of his leadership. For him, Jews who keep the Torah are to be honored, valued, and those who fail, they must be called out and, if necessary, fought fiercely. Strong in the mind of such a leader is the distinction between wicked and righteous, and everyone must fit into one of these two categories. The other kind of Jewish leader is an Ish Yemini, which means a man of the right side, a man who sees everything and anyone with the right eye, with kindness, with understanding, and exceptional tolerance. Such a leader sees the heart and soul of every person, of every Jew, and above all, he sees the person's potential. This leader of the right, he can open his heart and ears to everyone who calls upon him, to see their character and to see how they're improving, not where they are now. Now, these approaches are really two solar opposites. Those who burn with a zealous fire for the Torah's honor find it difficult to engage and tolerate those who don't. Conversely, those who love everyone and wish them pleasantness and sweetness, they find it difficult to call out those whose behavior is less than savory, preferring to brush their misdoings, like under the rug, or leave it to others to rebuke them. So, friends, this, the previous Rebbe explains, was this remarkable and unusual ability of Mordechai to be both an Ish Yehudi and an Ish Yemini at the same time. Someone who can zealously stand up for the Jewish observance and stridently call out its violators, but at the same time also love and believe in the value of these very same people. Because for Mordechai, not everyone was strictly for or against. Just because someone disagrees with me, and moreover, just because someone just becomes engaged in wrongful and even maybe in immoral conduct, doesn't mean that I must treat him as a traitor. Just the opposite, says Mordechai. Mordechai lived in a generation when the masses preferred King Ahasuerus and his antics over the word of God. They made terrible, harmful mistakes that unfortunately endangered all of Jewry. Yet on the other extreme, Mordechai stubbornly refused to even nod his head toward the wicked Haman, risking his very life for that. But instead of denouncing his brethren, Mordechai steadfastly believed that despite their errors, the Jewish people were still the essence of good deep in their hearts. And if they erred and made a mistake, their error ultimately came from a good place. So when Haman passed his horrible decree, this very terrible decree to annihilate the Jewish people, God forbid, Mordechai didn't get up and say, I told you so, guys. You wanted Achashverosh, you wanted the wicked king, you got him. Just the opposite. Mordechai understood that Jews who tried to integrate themselves with the Persians were wrong. But they only did so because of the peer pressures, because of the difficulties of the time. It wasn't really who they were in their essence. So instead of lecturing people and writing scathing articles in the local times, you know what he did? He gathered the masses in their time of sheer trouble, and he inspired them to return to God. He did this because although Mordechai was an Ish Yehudi, whose identity and honor of the Torah reigned supreme in his life, and who proudly and fiercely descended it at any cost, who knew the use of the trade of strength and speak truth to power and be stern and immovable when necessary. Nevertheless, the defining mark of an Ish Yehudi is that he's also an Ish Yemini. He's someone that sees the good in every Jew, and he looks at him with his right eye, and he draws him close to the Torah, close to the divine service, and to do good deeds. See, Mordechai, he would do what he had to do, but at the same time, he believed in the inherent goodness of every single Jew of his time. Mordechai's beliefs about his fellow Jews proved correct, because we know that after the decree was passed to annihilate all the Jews by Haman, the wicked, and Mordechai implored the people to return to God, they didn't disobey him, they actually listened. His cries fell on the most listening of ears and open hearts. And indeed, friends, for an entire year with this horrible threat of annihilation hanging over the heads of the Jewish people of that time, and in the face of persecution by their neighbors and by former friends, not one Jew tried to escape his identity, but embraced it and resolved it from now and forever to live with it. And when Esther commanded Mordechai, please go gather all the Jews in Shushan, fast for me, the Megillah tells us that Mordechai passed and he did everything Esther asked him to do and commanded him to do. And Mordechai listened to Esther, and all the Jews listened to Mordechai. They all participated in this just like an unbelievable awakening of belief in God and understanding that only God can save them. Not one Jew was absent. It was a wondrous, miraculous fact that we find nowhere else in history. You know when Moses took the Jews out of Egypt? Do you know he only took 20% out of Egypt? Because the other 80% didn't want to leave. They died during the plague of darkness. Do you know that when Matisyahu, during the time of the story of Hanukkah, when he waged war against the Syrian Greeks, do you know just a tiny little faction of his brethren joined? Do you know why? Because most of the Jews at that time were Hellenists. They were on the other side. They were with the Greeks. But Mordechai and Esther, they mobilized 100% of the people. Now you may ask, well, why did everybody follow Mordechai? Seemingly, as the Megillah states, Haman sought to destroy all Jews who were throughout the entire kingdom of Achashverosh. That means the entire world. All of Mordechai's people. The whole reason for Haman's hatred for the Jews was because Mordechai was one of them. And the whole risk for a Jew at that time was to be part of Mordechai's people. Now really? A Jew could have saved his life by distancing himself from Mordechai, by saying, look, I've been a loyal Persian for 70 years. I got a Persian passport. I pay taxes on time. I got nothing to do with this man, Mordechai. But do you know Not one Jewish person took that approach. Instead, 100% of them followed Mordechai's lead and put their faith and trust in the Holy One, blessed be He. Now surely Mordechai's joint approach of Ish Yehudi and the Ish Yemini and his success with awakening the Jewish people of his time to repent, they're all related. Because when a leader can stand up for his beliefs, but also see people with the right eye and believe and seek out the good in every Jew, that is when every Jewish person follows him, even if it means putting himself in danger. Now you might say, you know what, Rabbi, beautiful thought. It's all good and nice to hear about Mordechai's approach with the people of Shushan, but that was 2,400 years ago. Is this something we can emulate today in 2024? You know, they tell the story of a governor of one of the big territories of Soviet Russia took it upon himself to visit the small little towns in his district. He wanted to inspire the masses about the communist ideals. So he gathered all the people in the town center in his little town, and he would say, "Who is willing to give 1,000,000 rubles for Mother Russia?" Everyone nodded their heads. Yes, approvingly, of course, everything for Mother Russia. And then he said, "Who is willing to give 100 acres for Mother Russia?" And again, everyone said, yes, everyone cheered. Everything for Mother Russia. And then he goes, "Who is willing to give up their goat for Mother Russia?" This time, nobody budged. "What happened?" the governor said. "You're willing to give up your acres, your land, and everything. But why you, for Mother Russia, why are you balking now when I ask for your goat?" One man piped up, "You don't understand. 2 goats we actually have." Point is, it's easy to commit to what we don't have. But how could we emulate both sides of Mordechai with what we do now? How could we live Purim today in this year, 2024, 5784, to be a Mordechai? Now, the Jewish world is caught up in a particularly heated events, especially in Israel. There's protests and apparent for the government, against the government, as who could more forcefully prove that each side is more important and we can eliminate the others. There's so much war and disagreement, unfortunately. It's alarming, to tell you the truth. But if people on both sides could take 5 minutes and think, here's another person who disagrees with me, but loves the country, loves our homeland, and loves the people no less than I. I mean, if you look at it that way, the whole equation changes. Because even assuming that the other guy's approach is as dangerous as I think it is, I can still remind myself, like Mordechai reminded himself in his day, that there's an error here. But the error doesn't come to us because this other person is a traitor or an enemy. There are various pressures and factors at play here, and different ways of thinking. And if we drop all the hating, drop all the loathing, not only in Israel, here in the U.S. too, the chance of talking to one another and finding a path towards together is more likely. Moreover, let's think about this. Let's assume this other guy is really coming from a bad place, just for a moment. And he really doesn't care about our country, or he really doesn't care about the Jewish people. That doesn't end the ability to view him favorably. I mean, consider the Mishnah that was written 2 years ago. Ethics of Our Fathers says, "Judge every man to the side of merit." Hey, but could we really live up to such a blanket statement? I mean, sometimes it's easy. A child acts out, you say, you know what? That kid wants more attention. Maybe a plumber does a poor job, you say, you know what? Maybe you just go through a rough time, a hard day. But it's no secret that there are selfish, abusive, narcissistic people who have no limit to the amount of harm they're willing to inflict upon others. Some people do wrong, and they do it for the wrong reasons. And they know what they're doing is wrong. And they proudly tell you that they're doing something wrong. How can we judge these type of people favorably? And even if you're going to say it's possible to judge this type of person favorably, honestly, what's the point of this apparent naivety? Being so naive? So here comes the Rebbe with his wisdom. And he explains in Likutei Sichos, volume 27. The key here, he said, is not to judge the behavior favorably, but to judge the person, the whole person favorably. We must understand that what we see on the surface is really not the whole person. So even if a person sins in the most unspeakable way, that is not the whole story. It only accounts for what the person does while ignoring his potential. We must judge a person favorably, because to ignore a soul's potential while only harping on the body's actions would just simply be tragic. Every Jew has an entire world inside that has not sinned. An entire side to him that may be very deep, but it cries in pain over his failures. The sin need not be the end of the story. And if God puts a person in a situation where he's able to sin, that means he gives him the resources to overcome that urge and not sin. This means that there's a whole universe of untapped, unlimited divine potential. That's something we must respect, even if we want any chance at helping a person to turn his way around. And this principle, which applies to the national issues in Israel and here in the U.S., also applies to the micro-Israel that resides inside each of us. The Jewish identity is being an Ish Yehudi, a conviction while being an Ish Yemini in our relationships. That means committed, like a zealous person, but look at another person favorably for their potential. You know, they tell the story about a Jew traveling on a train in the olden days, and the conductor wakes him up at 5 a.m. Traveled overnight, he wakes him up. In the middle of the night, a priest also boarded the train, and he hangs up his robe, and the priest goes to sleep in the bed right next to the Jewish person. In the early morning, it's dark, the Jew can't see a thing, and he puts on the priest's robe instead of his own coat. Noticing the robe in the mirror an hour later, the Jew says to himself, "What a fool that conductor is. Instead of waking me up, he woke up the priest." Friends, we often confuse the clothing for the person. A Jew robed in a foreign fashion does not make him foreign, God forbid. Because nestled inside is a divine soul, and a divine soul is never disconnected from God. I want to share a story that took place in 1967 about an Israeli reporter of a newspaper, Mr. Amikam. He was in New York, and he visited 770 Lubavitch World Headquarters to receive some honey cake from the Rebbe before the high holy day of Yom Kippur for a sweet year. Thousands were in line. The line was moving quickly, and each person that went by, the Rebbe gave him a honey cake and blessed him for a sweet year. Well, this reporter, Amikam, this is his turn. And the Rebbe gives him a piece of honey cake, and he said, "That's not a way to write about another Jew." He was shocked. He wasn't expecting to receive criticism from the Rebbe. Now, serving at that time in the Knesset was Mayor Wilner, parliament member. He was a leader of Israel's Communist Party, yes. And he was the youngest person to sign on the Declaration of Independence in 1948. He lived until 2003. And he headed the Communist Party in Israel, yes, can you imagine? 41 years he was in the Knesset. He was known for his far-left views. And on June 5th, 1967, when the outbreak of the Six-Day War, he was the only Jewish member of the Knesset actually to speak out against the war. He said, this is the darkest days in Israel history. Months later, on October 15th, shortly before the Yom Kippur, the Amikam visited the Rebbe. This was then. And he delivered a fiery, and when he came, this was after this, Mr. Wilner gave a fiery speech against Israel for all the problems they caused in the Middle East. And a tremendous political storm ensued. And when Wilner returned home that evening, he was waited by a man named Avram ben Moshe, who actually attacked him and he stabbed him in the stomach, but he survived. In the aftermath of that stabbing against this Jewish Communist Party leader, this reporter, Mr. Amikam, he wrote an article and he titled it, "Too Bad the Knife Wasn't Sharper." A few days after he wrote this article, he's standing now in front of the Rebbe, who tells him, this is not the way to write about another Jew. So he thought, Maybe the Rebbe was unaware of this Mr. Vilner's antics, and he tried to justify himself. But the Rebbe suggested to the Israeli reporter, Mr. Amikam, he said, I want you to ask my secretary for the transcript of the talk I gave this past Shabbat. And in it, the Rebbe quoted a statement from the Talmud that even the sinners amongst the Jewish people are filled with mitzvot, like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. And the Rebbe wondered in that talk, he said, if a sinner being a sinner is also full of seeds like a pomegranate, why state that he's full of mitzvot like a pomegranate? How many mitzvot could he have? And the Rebbe said, mitzvot and sins are not the same. He said, when a Jew does a mitzvah, any mitzvah, it fills him like a pomegranate. He feels so filled with joy, and he identifies with it. But when a Jew sins, he doesn't feel filled at all. He feels empty. Friends, judging others favorably and tolerating them even when their opinions and their actions seem just simply distasteful. You know when it becomes easier? And we follow the advice of the third Chabad Rebbe called the Tzemach Tzedek. You know what he said? Very beautiful. He said, the Torah says, love your fellow man as yourself. He said, how's it possible? By taking note of how self-love works, how can we do that? He said, every person is narcissistic and self-obsessed to some degree. We see it when a person is forced to confront his own failings. He says, you know what, we'll do anything to convince ourselves we're just not that bad. You know, we're not so bad. You know, King Solomon says, Ava mechasa, which means love covers over all sin, especially if it comes to your own sins. I mean, this covering of one's misdeed takes place in 3 stages. You know what they say. If you do something wrong, you have 3 stages. First, the person experiences self-loathing. Oh, why did I act so wrongly? Stage number 2, it's followed by an internal whitewashing of the story. Finally, when the whitewashing is over, in stage 3, a person arrives in stage 3 and he says, you know what? I really wasn't the aggressor at all. I was the victim. For example, imagine a man comes home from a long day work. He is hungry, he worked hard, and all he wants is just a simple plate of fresh chicken and rice waiting when he gets home. But unfortunately, his wife was just tired. She was exhausted that day taking care of the kids, and she just didn't cook anything. It's late at night, the stores are closed, the restaurants are closed, and it happens to be the fridge is empty. And he couldn't even find an egg to fry or a vegetable to make a salad. So the man just lets out his hunger and disappointment on who? On the most obvious target, with an angry tirade, his poor wife. A few minutes passes, and he just starts feeling bad. Like he says to himself, did my wife really deserve to be attacked like that? She was home all day, taking care of the house, taking care of the kids. What was I thinking of? What was I thinking of? What kind of terrible person am I? Now this stage 1, the self-loathing continues for a minute until the second stage arrives. And he goes, you know what? Hey, I'm not that bad, he says to himself. You know, I really worked hard all day to pay bills. Could you blame me for being upset when I have nothing to eat? I mean, do you really think anybody would act differently? Now the man feels a bit better about himself and he comes to the third stage. And he says, I don't understand. Why did my wife even get offended to begin with? I mean, didn't she realize how hard I work? How hungry I was? How could she? This precisely is the meaning of the commandment to love your fellow as yourself. Put that other person in your shoes, in your place, and judge him the same way you would judge yourself. So when the other person sins, stop for a moment and run the self-love test. Say to yourself, if I were standing in that person's place, how would I want to be judged? And you know what happens? Suddenly a window opens up and forgiveness and understanding seem possible. Suddenly we realize that's not who he is. He just had a bad moment. Indeed, he's the victim. And this message echoes loudly. This is what Hillel taught us. That which is hateful to you, don't do it to another. He said that's really the whole theme of the Torah. The rest is all interpretation, commentary. I mean, it's not just that you shouldn't rob him and hit him because, you know, you would hate that it should be done to you. What he's saying, what's particularly hateful to us is when we are judged by our weakness, when our mistakes are interpreted as who we are. And this is what we must not do to others. I'd like to share a story about a Jew who once visited the famed Hasidic town of Neville. My grandfather comes from Neville in White Russia. He comes into the synagogue and he's taken by the spiritual, pure atmosphere. Here sits a Chassid in prayer. There sat another one singing a niggun, a beautiful melody. And what particularly caught his attention was the sight of two Hasidim, righteous Jews, and they were animated and lovingly studying a very deep Hasidic discourse together. They were deep in their study. A while later, this visitor was walking in the market and he couldn't believe what he saw. Right before his eyes, the same two study partners who were deep in that spiritual study session, they were like really in a holy moment. You know what they were doing in the market? They were engaged in a disputed conversation over money. And he said, Hasidim are Hasidim, holy are holy until it comes to money. Late in the afternoon, he returns to the synagogue for the afternoon service of Mincha. Once again, he couldn't believe his eyes. These same two guys who were competing and arguing in the market, they were sitting and studying again together. It's like nothing happened. So he couldn't contain himself. And he says, guys, listen, I don't understand. 2 hours ago, you were at each other's throat. How are you suddenly getting along? Listen to what they answered. One of the Hasidim replied with a smile. Back in the market, it wasn't us fighting. It was just our rubles that were fighting. But us inside, we love each other. Friends, less than 2 weeks is Purim. Let us remember Mordechai, the Ish Yemini and Ish Yehudi, who taught us that there is always room to love and respect another. As Jewish mysticism Hasidus teaches us, it is when we can look beyond the surface and catch the sight of the potential of the soul within ourselves and the potential of the soul in our fellow brethren that we can truly be at peace and truly experience the joy of Purim, and even before that, the joy of the true and complete redemption, when the world will know of no war, no famine, no illness. Only peace and goodness will fill this world, when all swords will turn into plowshares, and we will experience true open godliness, and we will then see only goodness and kindness in our brethren. Let us prepare for Purim with a taste of the world to come. Thank you, my friends. Shalom. I look forward to seeing you next week. But until then, embrace your fellow friend who you couldn't look at him in the eye yesterday. But tomorrow, go over, give them a hug. Tell them, I am an Ish Yehudi and I am an Ish Yemini. I want to be like Mordechai. Shalom and happy Purim.